The wagon lurched to a stop where the mud began. Ruth Calder stepped down, skirts already heavy with road dust, and stared at what she'd traveled 3 days to reach. The logging camp sprawled between black pines and a swollen river, cabins stacked crooked against the hillside like broken bones. Smoke rose thin from scattered fires. Axes bit into wood somewhere beyond the trees, each strike echoing through the valley like a heartbeat that wouldn't quit. She'd left the river towns before dawn with one trunk and a letter that promised thin pay for hard work. The pencil marks had been smudged by sweat, the words desperate. A midwife. Willing to travel north. Need urgent. Ruth was willing. The work slowed when she appeared. Men straightened from their labor, axes balanced on shoulders, eyes narrowing. They wore the valley on their skin, mud caked to their boots, sawdust caught in their beards, faces carved hard by years of cutting timber that didn't care if they lived or died. One man spat into the dirt. A woman. Another laughed, low and mean. Thought we asked for help. She ain't built for this place, a third muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. Ruth stood still. Let them look. Let them say what they needed to say. She'd heard worse in the river towns when she'd arrived there years ago, young and untested. She'd learned to let words roll past like water over stone. No one moved to take her trunk. She lifted it herself, felt the weight of her tools inside, clean cloth, herbs wrapped in oil paper, needles she'd boiled 100 times, the knife her mother had carried before her. The trunk wasn't light. Her arms shook by the time she set it down near the nearest cabin, but she didn't let her face show it. A man emerged from the saw shed. Broad-shouldered, thick through the chest, beard streaked with gray that hadn't been earned by age alone. His eyes were dark and hollowed, sunk deep like he'd spent too many nights staring at things he couldn't fix. He moved with the deliberate weight of someone who'd forgotten how to rest. Jonah Hale. The camp boss. She knew him by reputation only, widowed, hard, fair when it suited him. He looked at her the way a man might look at a tool he hadn't ordered. Not with hostility. Just a doubt. You're the midwife, he said. Not a question. I am. He nodded once. No welcome in it. Just acknowledgement that she existed and had arrived. Cook shack's empty. You'll sleep there. No stove worth naming. One cot. Ruth didn't answer. Didn't need to. Jonah's gaze lingered a moment longer, something unreadable behind the exhaustion. You won't be needed long, he said. No babies here. She met his eyes without flinching. People don't stop bleeding just because they cut trees. For a moment, something almost like respect flickered across his face. Then it was gone. He turned and walked back toward the saw shed, shoulders bent under weight she couldn't see. The other men watched her. Waiting. Testing. Ruth picked up her trunk again and carried it toward the cook shack. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, the air smelled of old smoke and damp wood. The cot sagged in the corner, blanket thin as a promise. No window. One shelf. She set the trunk down carefully and opened it. Her hands moved through familiar motions, unfolding cloth, counting supplies, arranging tools within reach. Outside, the axes resumed their rhythm. Ruth Calder had come north to deliver life. The camp had other plans. The first morning came cold and gray. Ruth woke to the sound of men moving through mud, boots sucking at the earth with each step. Voices carried rough through the dawn, orders shouted, curses thrown, the scrape of metal against stone as blades were sharpened for another day of cutting. She dressed quickly, pinned her hair tight, and stepped outside. The camp sprawled before her in full daylight, meaner than it had looked the evening before. Cabins leaned against each other for support, roofs patched with whatever scraps could be found. Stumps jutted from the ground like grave markers. The river ran fast and dark beyond the tree line, swollen from spring rain that hadn't stopped falling for weeks. Men worked in pairs, hauling timber from the cutting grounds to the mill. their backs bent under the weight. Their hands were wrapped in cloth that had once been white but now carried the color of blood and bark. They moved with the rhythm of bodies that had forgotten softness. Ruth watched them. Learned their patterns. Who limped? Who favored one arm? Who coughed when he thought no one was listening? No one approached her. She spent the morning setting up what she could in a cook shack. Boiled water over a fire she built herself. Cleaned the shelf. Laid out her supplies in the order she'd need them, thread first, then needles, then the herbs that could slow bleeding or ease pain. She worked methodically, hands steady, mind clear. By midday, she'd walked the camp perimeter. Counted cabins. Noted where the well sat, where the mess hall gathered men for meals, where the sick would need to be laid if sickness came. It would come. It always did in places like this. The men pretended not to notice her. But their eyes followed. Suspicious. Wary. She was an intrusion into a world that had learned to function without softness, without care that didn't come with a price. The first injury arrived near sunset. A young man, couldn't have been more than 20, stumbled into the cook shack with his hand wrapped in a shirt already soaked through. His face was pale, jaw clenched against pain he wouldn't name. Got caught between the log and the chain, he said, voice tight. Ain't bad. Ruth gestured to the cot. Sit. He hesitated. Pride warred with pain. Pain won. He sat. She unwrapped the shirt carefully. The wound was deep, 2 fingers crushed, bone visible through torn skin. Blood welled fresh when she touched it. He hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. This needs stitching, Ruth said. Just wrap it. It'll fester. You'll lose the hand. He stared at her, weighing her words against what the other men would say if they found out he'd let a woman touch him. Finally, he nodded. Ruth worked quickly. Cleaned the wound with water she'd boiled that morning. Threaded the needle she'd carried from the river towns. Her hands moved with practiced certainty, each stitch placed exactly where it needed to be. The young man watched her work, breathing hard but staying still. When she finished, she wrapped his hand in clean cloth and tied it firm. Keep it dry, she said. Change the bandage every 2 days. Come find me if it starts to smell. He stood slowly, testing the weight of his hand. What do I owe you? Nothing. He frowned. Didn't understand. In the camps, everything cost something. Just keep it clean, Ruth said. He left without another word. But the next morning, when she stepped outside, there was firewood stacked beside her door. Split clean. Still smelling of sap. No note. No name. Ruth carried the wood inside and fed her fire. The camp was watching. She would let them watch. The days folded into each other, marked only by the rhythm of axes and the weight of rain. Ruth moved through the camp like a shadow the men couldn't ignore. She didn't wait for them to come to her. She went to them. A splinter driven deep into a palm, ignored until infection turned the skin hot and red. She lanced it, drained the poison, and wrapped it clean. The man cursed her while she worked but came back 3 days later to show her it had healed. A gash across a forearm opened when a saw blade kicked back. She stitched it closed while 2 others held the man steady, his teeth grinding so hard she thought they might crack. He didn't thank her. But he stopped laughing when she walked past. A fever that wouldn't break, leaving a man shaking under thin blankets. She boiled willow bark until the cabin filled with bitter steam, made him drink it though he fought her, stayed until the shaking eased. When he woke, she was gone. But he remembered. She worked quietly. Took their suspicion as part of the labor. Let them test her with silence and mockery, and cold shoulders turned when she needed help. She didn't ask for acceptance. She earned inches of it, 1 wound at a time. Jonah Hale watched from a distance. He moved through the camp like a man built from the same timber they cut, solid, unyielding, weathered by years that had stripped away everything soft. He spoke in short commands. Checked the work. Settled disputes with a look that made men remember why he ran things. But his eyes carried something else. Something older than exhaustion. Grief, maybe. Or the kind of emptiness that came after grief had burned itself out. Ruth saw him most evenings, standing near the riverbank, staring at water that never stopped moving. He stood alone. Always alone. Like he'd forgotten how to be otherwise. She didn't approach him. Didn't try to ease whatever weight he carried. Some wounds couldn't be cleaned with boiled water and stitched shut. Some had to heal on their own, if they healed at all. One afternoon, she found him in the saw shed, ledger open on a table scarred by years of use. His hand moved across the page, marking numbers that tallied timber cut, timber sold, supplies needed, wages owed. The math of survival. He looked up when her shadow crossed the doorway. Something you need? His voice was flat. Not unkind. Just tired. The well water's running cloudy, Ruth said. Men are drinking it anyway. Jonah's jaw tightened. Rivers high. Seeping into the ground. It'll make them sick. I know. He set down his pencil. Rubbed his face with both hands. We've got no choice. Can't haul clean water from town every day. Can't stop work every time the river rises. Ruth stepped closer. You could boil it. All of it. Before anyone drinks. That's a day's work just tending fires. Better than burying men. Jonah met her gaze. For a moment, something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or just the bitter acknowledgement that she was right and he didn't have the strength to fight it. Do what you think best, he said finally. I won't stop you. It wasn't permission. It wasn't gratitude. It was a surrender disguised as authority. Ruth nodded and left. She spent the rest of the day boiling water in every pot she could find. Set them over fires. Filled barrels when the water cooled. Worked until her back ached and her hands blistered from lifting iron that had been made for men twice her size. Some of the men helped. Not many. Just a few who'd stopped pretending she didn't know what she was doing. The sun set behind the pines, turning the sky the color of a bruise. Ruth stood outside the cook shack, arms shaking from the day's labor, and stared at the river. It kept rising. The rain didn't stop. It fell for 3 days straight, turning the camp into a churning mess of mud and standing water. The river climbed its banks, spilling into the low ground where the cabins sat. Men worked in water up to their ankles, cursing the sky and the valley and the timber that still needed cutting no matter how hard it poured. Ruth watched the water creep closer to the well. Watched it turn from clear to brown to something darker. She kept boiling. Kept filling barrels. Kept warning anyone who'd listen. Most didn't. The sickness started small. One man complained of chills during breakfast. Said he'd slept cold, that was all. By midday, he was shaking so hard he couldn't hold an axe. By evening, the fever had him flat on his back, skin burning, eyes glassy and unfocused. 2 more fell the next day. Then 5. Then the count stopped mattering because nearly every man in camp was either sick or tending someone who was. Ruth moved her supplies into the mess hall. It was the biggest space, the only place where she could lay bodies side by side and move between them without crawling over furniture. She cleared the tables of cards and tin cups and tobacco. Laid blankets down. Started marking who could still walk and who couldn't. The fever came fast and mean. It shook men until their teeth rattled. Made them sweat through their clothes and then freeze in air that wasn't cold. Some vomited. Others just lay still, too weak to do anything but breathe. Ruth worked through it all. She burned cloth to keep the air from fouling. Mixed herbs she'd carried from the river towns, feverfew and willow bark and sage that had been dried under summer sun. Boiled water until her arms felt like they'd been beaten with clubs. Bathed foreheads. Changed bandages. Held men steady when the shaking got so bad they thought they were dying. Maybe some of them were. She didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, someone called her name. Needed water. Needed help sitting up. Needed to know they weren't alone in the dark while their body tried to kill them. The men who could still stand started helping without being asked. Fetched water from the barrels she'd boiled. Held lamps so she could see what she was doing. Steadied bodies while she worked. They didn't speak much. Just moved when she needed them to move, stayed when she needed them to stay. The camp lost its shape. Axes hung on pegs, untouched. Fires burned low because no one had the strength to split more wood. The sound of saws disappeared, replaced by coughing that rattled through the valley like something trying to claw its way out. Ruth stopped counting hours. She counted breaths instead. Marked who was breathing easier. Who was breathing harder. Who had stopped breathing altogether. Jonah Hale lasted longer than most. He kept working through the first wave of sickness, moving between cabins, checking on men, making sure the fires stayed lit and the camp didn't fall apart completely. He worked like a man who thought willpower could hold off fever the same way it held off fear. It couldn't. Ruth found him near the riverbank on the fourth day. He'd collapsed in the mud, face gray, breath coming shallow and fast. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at the sky he didn't seem to see. Two young men who'd never mocked her helped drag him inside. He was heavy, all muscle and bone and weight that didn't want to move. They laid him on a table near the back of the mess hall, away from the others but not separate. Ruth pressed a hand to his forehead. The heat came off him like a forge. His fever burned hotter than the rest. Jonah's eyes found her through the haze of fever. His lips moved, shaping words that came out rough and broken. "Don't waste time on me," he rasped. "See to the others." Ruth pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, wrung it out, pressed it again. "You're not different. Lie still." He tried to turn his face away, but the effort cost him. His breath hitched. Sweat soaked through his shirt, darkening the fabric until it clung to his chest. "I buried my wife in winter," he said, voice cracking. "Don't need another woman killing herself on my account." Ruth didn't answer. She'd heard dying men talk before. Heard them confess things they'd carried for years, secrets that spilled out when fever loosened their grip on pride. She didn't judge. Didn't offer comfort that would ring hollow. She just stayed. She worked through the night, moving between bodies laid across tables and floor. Changed cloths. Rationed what little clean water remained. Boiled the river until her hands blistered and bled from lifting pots that had never been meant for work like this. Supplies thinned faster than she could replace them. Clean cloth ran out first. Then the herbs. Then the thread she'd been using to stitch wounds that reopened when men thrashed in their sleep. She tore her own skirts when the bandages were gone. Ripped the fabric into strips, boiled them, used them until they fell apart. The hem climbed higher. She didn't care. Modesty meant nothing when men were dying. Jonah drifted in and out like a man caught between two shores. Sometimes his eyes opened and he saw her. Sometimes he stared through her at something she couldn't see. He muttered his wife's name, Sarah, over and over, the syllables worn smooth by repetition and grief. When the fever peaked, he gripped Ruth's wrist so hard she thought the bone might crack. His eyes were wild, unseeing, lost in some dark place where she couldn't follow. She held fast. Didn't pull away. Spoke low and steady, words that didn't matter as much as the sound of her voice cutting through the fever's lies. "You're still here," she said. "Stay here." His grip loosened. "Not much. just enough that blood could flow back into her fingers. The night stretched long and terrible. Ruth moved through the mess hall like a ghost, stopping at each body to check breathing, adjust blankets, and offer water to cracked lips. Some men recovered slowly, fever breaking in pieces until they could sit up and take broth. Others didn't. She stopped trying to save everyone. Started triaging instead. Focused her strength where it could do the most good. It was a cold calculation, one that left her feeling hollow, but it kept more men breathing than kindness alone ever could. The camp changed around her. Suspicion faded first. The men who could still move stopped questioning her methods. They watched her work and saw competence where they'd expected weakness. Saw endurance where they'd predicted failure. Pride went next. Men who'd mocked her a week ago now held lamps without being asked. Fetched water she couldn't carry. Stayed awake when she needed extra hands and never complained about the cost. What remained was need. Raw and honest. The kind that stripped away everything else. Jonah's fever broke on the fourth night. Not cleanly. Not all at once. But the heat left his skin degree by degree, his breathing slowed from desperate gasps to something steadier, and when Ruth pressed her hand to his forehead, she felt sweat instead of fire. She sagged against the table, strength finally spent. Her vision blurred. Her hands shook. She'd been awake for days, moving on nothing but will and the knowledge that stopping meant death. She slept where she sat, head bowed, hands still wrapped around Jonah's. Ruth woke to silence. Not the silence of death, but something else. Something quieter and more fragile. The mess hall had settled into a rhythm she hadn't heard in days, steady breathing, the crackle of low fires, the rustle of men shifting under blankets without the violent shaking that had defined every movement before. She lifted her head slowly. Her neck ached. Her spine felt like it had been twisted and left to set wrong. Every muscle in her body screamed when she moved. Jonah was awake. His eyes were open, clear for the first time since the fever had taken him. Pale, yes. Weak, certainly. But present. He watched her with an expression she couldn't name, something between confusion and recognition, as if he'd expected to wake somewhere else entirely. "You stayed," he said. His voice was rough, scraped raw by days of fever. Yes. He didn't look away. Didn't offer thanks or apology or any of the words men usually reached for when they didn't know what else to say. He just watched her, taking in the exhaustion carved into her face, the torn hem of her skirt, the blood dried under her fingernails. Ruth stood carefully. Her legs nearly buckled. She steadied herself against the table and moved to the next man, checking his breathing, feeling for fever that might have returned in the night. The work continued. Recovery came slow and uneven. Some men rose within days, shaky but alive, able to take broth and sit outside in sunlight that felt like a gift. Others stayed flat for a week or more, bodies too damaged by fever to do anything but endure. 3 didn't rise at all. Ruth stood with the camp on the ridge where the graves were dug. The earth was hard, fought every strike of the shovel, but the men kept digging. No one spoke during the burial. No prayers were offered. Just silence and the weight of bodies lowered into ground that would hold them until the valley itself forgot they'd ever cut timber here. She watched Jonah stand at the edge, hat in his hands, face carved from stone. He didn't cry. Didn't speak. Just stood witness to loss he couldn't prevent and wouldn't forget. When it was done, the men walked back to camp in quiet pairs. Work resumed in pieces. Not the full brutal pace from before, but enough. Men leaned heavier on one another now. Helped lift what one alone couldn't manage. Shared food without needing to be asked. The camp had been broken open by sickness and put back together differently. Ruth moved through it with steady purpose. Changed bandages. Checked wounds that were healing and wounds that weren't. Boiled water until the river ran clear again and the threat of sickness finally passed. When she walked through camp now, heads dipped in acknowledgement. Paths cleared not from suspicion but respect. Men who'd mocked her weeks ago now nodded when she passed, some offering quiet thanks, others just meeting her eyes in a way that said enough. Jonah recovered slowly. First with a walking stick, leaning hard on wood that had been cut and smoothed by hands that knew what he needed. Then without it, moving carefully but moving, his strength returning in small measures. He spoke more to her now. Not of his wife, not of the grief that still carved lines into his face. He spoke of work. How the camp ran. Where help was needed. What winter would demand if they weren't ready. Practical things. Safe things. Ruth listened. She'd learned that listening was its own kind of care. That some men needed silence more than comfort. That presence mattered more than words when words had all been used up. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the pines and painted the sky in shades of amber and rust, Jonah found her outside the cook shack. The river ran lower now, cleaner. The mud had dried into hard ruts that held the shape of boots and wagon wheels. Evening air carried the smell of pine sap and cook fires, familiar scents that meant the camp had found its rhythm again. Jonah stood a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice but far enough to leave space between them. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, fingers tracing the brim like he was working through words he hadn't yet found. "I don't know what comes next," he said finally. Ruth looked at him. Really looked. Saw the gray threading through his beard, the lines carved deep around his eyes, the way his shoulders still carried weight that had nothing to do with timber. But she also saw something else now, a man who'd come back from fever and found the world hadn't ended while he was gone. "Neither do I," she said. He nodded. That seemed to be enough. He didn't press for more. Didn't ask her to define what this was or what it might become. Just stood there in the fading light, two people who'd survived something together and weren't quite sure what that meant yet. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came after hard truths had already been spoken, after pretense had been burned away by necessity. After a moment, Jonah put his hat back on. "Camp'll need you through winter," he said. "Men get careless when the cold sets in. Frostbite. Accidents on ice. Someone will need to keep them from killing themselves with stupidity." It wasn't a question. But it wasn't quite a statement either. It lived somewhere in between, leaving her room to say no if she wanted to. Ruth thought about the river town she'd left behind. The room she'd rented above the general store. The routine of births and fevers and wounds that all blurred together after a while. She thought about what waited for her there, nothing permanent, nothing that needed her specifically, just the same work in a different place. Then she thought about the cook shack that had started to feel less temporary. The men who nodded when she passed. The rhythm of the camp that she'd learned without meaning to. The way Jonah looked at her now, like she was real and solid and not going anywhere. "I'll stay through winter," she said. Something shifted in Jonah's expression. Not quite a smile. Just an easing of the lines around his eyes, a softening that suggested relief he wouldn't name out loud. "Good," he said. "Then, after a pause, we'll get you a better stove. And fix that door." Ruth almost smiled. That would help. They stood together as the light failed and the valley filled with shadows. The camp settled around them, fires burning low, men finishing their evening meals, the distant sound of someone playing a harmonica badly but with feeling. This wasn't the kind of love that arrived with declarations and promises. It didn't announce itself with grand gestures or words rehearsed until they sounded right. It grew the way moss grew on the north side of trees, slowly, quietly, in the spaces where light and moisture met and made something living possible. It was built from small things. A hand steadying another when the ground was uneven. Silence shared without the need to fill it. The knowledge that someone would stay even when staying was hard. Ruth had come north to deliver life. To catch babies and guide them into the world with hands that knew what to do when screaming started and blood flowed. She'd found something else instead. A camp that had learned how to live again. Men who'd remembered how to care for something beyond timber and wages. And a man who'd buried his wife in winter and thought he'd buried the possibility of anything else along with her. Jonah looked at her one more time before heading back toward his cabin. Winter came to the valley the way it always did, slowly at first, then all at once. Frost crept across the ground each morning, turning mud into iron and breath into clouds. The river slowed, its surface going still and dark before ice began to form along the edges. Ruth stayed. The stove arrived in pieces on a wagon from town, hauled up the mountain by men who grumbled about the weight but installed it carefully in the cook shack anyway. The door was fixed. Hinges oiled. The gaps in the walls were stuffed with moss and tar to keep the wind from cutting through. It became a place she could live in, not just survive. The work changed with the season. Frostbite replaced fever. Broken bones from falls on ice replaced crushed fingers from saw blades. Men came to her without shame now, knowing she'd tend them without judgment or cost beyond keeping the wound clean. Jonah stopped by most evenings. Sometimes with a reason, checking if she needed more firewood, asking if the stove drew properly, mentioning which men were coughing and might need watching. Sometimes without one. He'd just stand in her doorway, hat in his hands, and they'd talk about nothing important. The weather. The timber count. How the camp would handle the first real snow. Other times they didn't talk at all. He'd sit on the step outside her door and she'd sit beside him, both of them watching the stars come out over the pines. Those silences said more than conversation ever could. Love didn't arrive like lightning or flood. It accumulated like snowfall, one quiet moment laid over another until the shape of something new emerged. One night, when the cold bit deep and the fires burned high, Jonah reached for her hand. Not dramatically. Just a slow movement of calloused fingers finding hers, holding gently, testing whether she'd pull away. She didn't. They sat like that until the cold drove them inside, hands linked, breath visible in the frozen air. The camp thrived in its own rough way. Men worked hard and came back whole more often than not. They looked after each other with a care that hadn't existed before the sickness. Shared supplies. Checked on the ones who worked alone. Built a community from necessity that had become something closer to choice. Ruth walked through it as someone who belonged. Not as an outsider to be tested or a stranger to be tolerated. Just as Ruth. The woman who'd stayed when staying mattered. Who'd worked until her hands bled. Who'd refused to let them die alone in the dark. Spring would come eventually. The river would rise again. Timber would need cutting. Life would continue in the pattern it always had, shaped by seasons and work and the valleys in different rhythms. But something had changed. Ruth stood outside the cook shack one morning, watching the sun rise over the ridge where the graves sat. The light touched the trees first, then spilled down into the camp, warming wood and earth and the faces of men already moving toward another day's labor. Jonah appeared beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. They'd moved past the need for constant words, finding something more substantial in the spaces between. She'd come north with one trunk and a letter asking for help. She'd stayed because the camp learned how to live, not just survive, but actually live. With care. With effort. With the understanding that survival meant nothing if you faced it alone. Ruth had brought life into the world with her hands for years. Delivered babies. Saved the dying. Stitched wounds that should have killed. Here, she'd done something different. She'd helped a broken place remember how to heal. And in the process, she'd healed too. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold tales from the Wild West. These are the stories history forgot, of courage, survival, and the people who built life in the hardest places. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought of Ruth's journey. And if you know someone who loves real Western stories, share this with them. Thanks for listening. and I'll see you in the next one.